You are watching the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. The Humanities 101 Foundation welcomes you.
Hello, Nacho Knots, and welcome back to Nachos, the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. I am Dr. Adam Dutch Hazlett, your host, and I welcome you back. As we begin to close out February 2026, I want to invite you to take a breath with me. Not a performative, everything is fine breath, but the kind that makes room for the truth. The kind that says, I am here, I made it to this moment, and that counts. If this moment and this month has felt heavy, if it's felt rushed, or if it's felt strangely foggy, you are not alone. If it's felt gentle, steady, or even quietly hopeful, you don't have to apologize for that either. Every nervous system comes into the room carrying a different weather report. So wherever you're listening from, I hope this episode feels like a warm landing. Not a demand, not a lecture, not another place where you have to prove you're doing life correctly, but a space to soften your shoulders and let your inner world be a little less defended. We're allowed to arrive as we are, tired, energized, overwhelmed, regulated, uncertain, curious, grieving, relieved. All of it is human and all of it belongs. And as February draws to a close, it's also a good time to notice what we've learned about ourselves this month. What helped, what didn't, what we wished had been different, and what we want to carry forward, not as a self-improvement project, but as self-understanding practice. Because when we understand ourselves, we can advocate for ourselves. And when we advocate for ourselves, we make more room for belonging. So I want to start with this quote. What you see and what you hear depends a great deal on where you're standing. This is a C.S. Lewis line, and it feels like a hand on a shoulder at exactly the right moment. Because so much of what we call miscommunication or conflict or overreaction is actually perspective. The angle of light, the position of the body, the context the brain is using to interpret the moment. Where you are standing matters. What you have survived matters. What your sensory system is doing matters. Whatever you've been taught to fear or to ignore or to tolerate at your own expense, that matters too. And today we're going to explore what changes when we gently shift our stance and ourselves and each other a little more interpretive grace. And before we move into the heart of today's conversation, a quick, gentle reminder for my students listening. Your midterm is coming due soon. All the details and directions are posted on the course website and Google Classroom, so please make sure you take a look there and give yourself a little planning runway. And I want to emphasize this because it matters. The most important thing is the heart of the project, not the spit and polish. I'm looking for your thinking, your effort, your voice, and your care. I am not looking for perfection. If you can show me what you are trying to do and why it matters to you, you are already on the right track. So start where you are, use supports available, and let this be a learning moment, not a stress test. And one more practical reminder, Nacho Knots, especially for my students. For the midterm, you will submit your URL link, not the file, to the assignment section in Google Classroom. That link is what I grade. So make sure it is a shareable URL that actually opens for someone who is not you. And please get that link submitted before spring break so you are not carrying it around in your brain like a loose battery rolling around in your pocket. And then, once you've submitted it, I need you to do something that sounds simple, but is honestly one of the most mature skills you can build in college. Take spring break. Not spring break plus an invisible backpack of guilt. Not spring break where you keep half working because you're afraid to fall behind. I mean truly take a break from school. Rest is not what you do when everything is finished. Rest is part of how the system stays functional. Recharging is not a reward for perfect performance. It is maintenance. It is regulation. It is how your brain consolidates learning, how your body recovers from stress, how your mood stabilizes, how your creativity returns. It's how you keep yourself from living in emergency mode all the time. So I want you to plan for recovery the way you plan for deadlines. Put it on the calendar. Protect it. Treat it as real because it is. Sleep a little more. Eat something with actual nutrients. Take a walk. Watch something comforting. Spend time with people who do not make you feel like you have to audition for belonging. Do something that reminds your nervous system it's safe to be human and not a machine. Because in this class and in this community, we're practicing a different way of living. We are practicing sustainability, and spring break is part of that system. And here's the thing. Spring break is not only for people with student IDs. Even if you are long past school or never there in the first place, you still have a nervous system. You still have a body that keeps score. You still have a brain that cannot run on full speed forever without consequence. So if you're listening right now and thinking, must be nice, I didn't get a spring break, I want to gently challenge that. Maybe you don't get a full week. Maybe you can't step away in a way that you wish you could, like to Daytona Beach or to Cabo. But you can still take a spring break in principle. You can still build a pause into the system. Maybe it's a long weekend you protect like it's sacred. Maybe it's a Friday night where you don't answer emails. You don't solve anyone else's crises, and you don't clean the whole house to prove that you deserve rest. Maybe it's one fun night off, the kind where you laugh too loud or eat something you love or go somewhere that makes you feel like yourself again. Maybe it's a slow morning with your phone on Do Not Disturb and a cup of coffee that actually gets to get drank while it's still warm. And I want to say this clearly. Doing something just for yourself is not selfish. It is stabilizing. It's preventative care. It's the little pressure release valve that keeps everything from blowing. When we never pause, we start living like every day is a deadline and every moment an emergency. And that's not sustainable for anybody, neurodivergent or not. So as we move into this conversation, here's your participation question for this week. Name one specific thing you will do on your spring break to recharge. One pause you're actually willing to protect. It can be small. It can be simple. It can be practical. A long walk, a movie night, a phone-free morning, a coffee with a friend, an early bedtime, a day trip, a few hours where you don't do anything productive on purpose. The goal is not to impress me. The goal is to name something. The goal is to choose something real that gives your nervous system a chance to exhale and then follow through with the care you would want for someone you love. Treat yourself like that someone. So again, I want you to answer this plainly and specifically. What is one thing you will do for your spring break recharge, and when will you do it? And really, I thank you for holding this question with me, because the simple act of choosing a recharge, naming it, and protecting it is already a perspective shift. It's you stepping out of the default setting that says, I only matter when I'm producing, and stepping into a different stance that says, my well-being is part of the system. And that brings us right into our main topic today, perspective. Where we stand changes what we notice. It changes what we interpret as threat, what we interpret as feedback, what we interpret as failure, and what we interpret as possibility. Two people can live through the same moment and walk away with completely different stories, not because one is lying, but because they're standing in different places when it happens. So today, we're going to explore what it means to gently move our feet, to look at our own lives, our own relationships, our work, and our inner self-talk from a slightly different angle. Not to invalidate our experience and not to talk ourselves out of what hurts, but to widen the frame, to create just a little more room for curiosity, compassion, and understanding. And when I talk about perspective, I'm not talking about some abstract idea I picked up from a book. For me, this goes all the way back to childhood and to my dad. For a time, my dad was an engineer with Abbott Labs, and he worked on products like Pedialyte and Pediasure. But his lane was not the formula. He was a packaging engineer. His job was to think about delivery, design, and function, how something meets a human being in the real world, how it opens, how it pours, how it holds together, how it survives being shipped, handled, and used, sometimes by two people who are stressed, tired, and in a hurry, or doing the best they can in a hospital room at 2 a.m. He held multiple patents. He was literally a patent holder. He designed new ways products are delivered, and it was that kind of inventor brain was just normal in our house. And remind me, I'll tell you some horror stories about that sometime. And I think in a quiet way, that is where some of my universal design instincts come from. Because he didn't look at a bottle and just see a bottle. He saw a system. He saw hands. He saw context. He saw the moment of use. And he also taught me something that ended up shaping my whole life. He taught me to change my perspective. He would say it directly, of course, slow down, look at it from a different angle, but he would also do it in the most literal dad way possible. I can still see him doing this if I was stuck on homework, especially geometry. He would take the paper right out of my hands, flip it upside down, and slide it back to me like it was a magic trick, and would say, "Now look at it." Not because the math changed, but because how my brain saw it changed. The moment you force yourself out of the groove you were stuck in, you stop fighting the problem the same way. You start noticing things you could not see before. And that lesson stayed with me. Even now, when I'm revising something I've written, I will sometimes use a text reader and listen to my words in a different voice, even with an accent. It's the same draft, the same sentences, but hearing it instead of seeing it changes the perspective. It helps me catch what my eyes skip over. It helps me hear the rhythm, the awkward spots, the parts that do not land the right way. In a funny way, it's the grown-up version of my dad flipping the page upside down. And that's what I want to offer you today, not as a motivational poster, but as a practical tool. If you feel stuck, irritated, or if you feel like you're spiraling, sometimes the most compassionate move is not to push harder, it's to change your angle. So here's a few simple ways that you can do that in your daily life. You can change the medium. If you're staring at words, listen to them. If you're stuck in your head, write it out. If you're overwhelmed by a task, sketch it out as a map or checklist. It's the same content, but in a different doorway. You could also change the question. Instead of, "Why can't I do this?" try, "What part of this is unclear?" or "What would make this 10% easier?" Instead of, "What is wrong with me?" try, what is my nervous system trying to protect me from? You can also change the vantage point. Take a short walk, stand up, jiggle, move to a different room, look out a window. It sounds a little too simple, but your body position affects your perception more than we like to admit. You can also borrow a voice. Ask, what would I say to a friend in this situation? Or what would, Doc or a supportive coworker or a loving grandparent say right now? This isn't cheesy. It's perspective taking, and it can interrupt shame or fear or guilt. You could also shrink the frame on purpose. When life feels huge, ask, what is the next right step? Not the next 10 steps, the next one. Perspective is not only about seeing more, sometimes it's about seeing less so that you can breathe. We can widen the frame on purpose. When one moment feels like it defines you, ask yourself, will this matter in a month? Will this matter in a year? Will this matter in a decade? It doesn't erase the pain, but it puts everything in its correct size. And maybe the most important one is this: always assume there is missing context in yourself, in other people, and in situations. When your brain wants to lock into a single explanation, they hate me, I failed, I'm stupid, this is always how it goes. Pause and gently ask, what else could be true? The question alone has saved a lot of relationships and a lot of inner peace, including my own. Because what you see and what you hear really does depend on where you're standing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is move your feet. And this is where that childhood story connects so naturally to the bigger NACHOS mission. When we talk about perspective, we are not just talking about clever mental tricks. We're talking about self-understanding. Because the more you understand how your mind works, the more you stop treating your reactions like moral failures. You start seeing them as information. You start noticing patterns, what overload feels like before it becomes shutdown, what anxiety sounds like before it becomes urgency, what shame tries to convince you of when you are tired and vulnerable. Perspective is often the difference between I am broken and I am having a very human response to a real set of conditions. And once we can see ourselves more clearly, it becomes easier to practice self-regulation with dignity instead of force. Regulation is not pretending you are fine. It's learning how to come back to center in ways that do not punish you for having needs. Sometimes changing perspective is the first regulation step. Stepping back from the mental ledge, widening the frame and saying, okay, my nervous system is activated. And that's not a character flaw. What does it need right now? What does it want right now? That one moment of clarity can turn a spiral into a pause and a pause into a choice. That is also why perspective is deeply connected to self-care. Real self-care is not always bubble baths or perfect routines. Sometimes it's choosing a different angle before you burn yourself out. It's recognizing that pushing harder is not always the answer, and that rest, support, and simplicity are legitimate strategies. Keep it simple, stupid. It is treating your mind like a system that needs maintenance, not like a machine that should never need to recharge. When we shift perspective, we often find a more sustainable path, one that respects the limits of the human body and the real rhythms of neurodivergent life. And finally, perspective is one of the cleanest doorways into self-grace. Grace is not lowering your standards. It's telling the truth about how hard things can be and choosing kindness anyway. It's remembering that you are more than your worst day. You are more than your tone in a tense moment, more than your productivity, more than the version of yourself that shows up when you're depleted. When we can change our vantage point, we can often see ourselves the way a compassionate person would, with context, with complexity, and with a little more patience. So if you take nothing else from this section of the episode, take this. The goal is not to become a different person. The goal is to understand yourself well enough that you can care for yourself wisely. Perspective is not about denying reality. It's about making enough room inside of reality for repair, for learning, and for the gentle truth that you deserve to be treated with care by others, yes, but also by yourself. And with all this in mind, I want to invite us into another story for today because it takes everything we've just been talking about, self-understanding, self-regulation, self-care, and self-grace, and it puts it into one surprisingly clear, almost cinematic moment. And it's a reminder that perspective is not just an internal practice. Perspective changes what we think we are witnessing. It changes what we think counts, and it changes what we assume about somebody else's effort. And just as importantly, it changes what we assume about our own. So I want to tell you a story that has been bubbling up again because this story went viral back in 2024, and it's been coming up because of the Olympics. And everybody's been paying attention to the ice and little moments that reveal how humans think under pressure. And it's sports, yes, but it's also one of the cleanest, clearest little parables I've ever seen about human understanding, hidden effort, and the way our brains cling to a familiar scoreboard even when the scoreboard is wrong. So picture this. It's 2024, the Winter Youth Olympics in South Korea. Women's 1,500-meter short track speed skating. A young Chinese skater, Yang Jingru, does something that looks almost confusing. She takes off early, like really early. She sprints, creates separation, and then she does the wild part. She laps the entire field, meaning she has skated an extra lap compared to everyone else. Then she does the part that breaks everyone's brain. She eases off and blends back in at the back of the pack, just sort of sitting there like she's struggling to keep up. But she's not struggling. She is managing the race from a position of advantage because she has already banked a whole lap. And if you don't know this, at the end of speed skating, for the last lap, a bell rings. That means the final lap. The other skaters hear this bell and they sprint like their lives depend on it because they think this is it. But they're actually still one whole lap behind her. The final lap call is based on the leader, which is Yang, not the pack. So the pack pours everything into what they think is the finish. And then Yang crosses the line, and you can almost feel the confusion ripple through the arena. And here's the part that makes it such a perfect NACHOS moment. Nobody cheated. Nobody did anything illegal. And Yang's teammate, because she knew what was going on, came in second place. It was a strategy. Sometimes it's described as a rabbit tactic, and it worked largely because everyone else kept skating the race they assumed they were in, not the race that they were actually in. Now let's step off the ice and connect this to what we've been building in this episode. Because Nacho Nuts, this is what perspective teaches us to notice. We live our lives inside shared assumptions. We assume we all agree on what progress looks like. We assume that the scoreboard is neutral. We assume that the scoreboard is obvious. We assume that it's the same for everyone, but it's not. And self-understanding begins right there, with the willingness to admit, I may not be seeing the whole race. Because it's not weakness. That's cognitive humility. And it's one of the most compassionate moves a human being can make. It creates room for curiosity instead of judgment. It creates room for questions instead of conclusions. It creates room for repair, real repair. And self-regulation shows up here too, because when we misunderstand someone else's pace, our nervous system often reacts before our wisdom does. We get irritated, we get threatened, we get defensive. We fill in the blanks with the fastest available story. Regulation is the pause that says, let me slow down, let me look again, let me consider that there might be invisible effort here. Because the biggest lesson in that viral race is not be clever. The lesson is this: there are invisible laps in human life. There are laps people skate that no one claps for because nobody sees them. Think about the invisible laps so many neurodivergent folks skate every day. Masking, self-regulating and overstimulation, trying to track a conversation while your nervous system is on high alert, smiling at the right time, holding your body still, forcing eye contact, translating your thoughts into a format the room accepts. That's a whole lap. Sometimes it's 2 or 3, and the room doesn't count it. So when you finally slow down and the world says, what happened to you? And you're thinking, I've been skating hard the whole time. This is where self-care enters the story. Because self-care is often the moment you stop sprinting for a finish line that is not actually the finish line. It's the moment you realize you've been living under a scoreboard that rewards what looks like competence instead of what is actually sustainable, healthy competence. It's the moment you choose a pacing strategy that keeps you whole. And then comes self-grace, which might be the hardest part for a lot of us. Because when the world does not count your invisible laps, you can start not counting them too. You can start calling yourself behind when you're actually exhausted. You can start calling yourself lazy when you're actually overloaded. You can start calling yourself too much when you're actually doing the work of 3 nervous systems at once. But grace says, no, I've been skating. It's counted. It's cost me something, and I'm allowed to honor that. And here's where humans get especially messy. When we don't understand someone else's pacing, we moralize it. If someone's slow, we call them lazy. If someone is fast, we call them intense or too much. If someone blends in, we call them disengaged. If someone opts out, we call them difficult. But what if it's not a moral issue at all? What if it's simply that they're not on, that they are on a different lap, or they're a lap behind or a lap ahead than we can actually see? In that race, the other skaters were not stupid. They were skating the normal meta of short track. Conserve energy, fight for position, sprint late. Yang disrupted that expectation, and everyone else stayed loyal to the script. And guys, that's so human. We trust the script more than we trust reality. So here's the Nachos invitation, Nacho Knots. Before you judge someone else's pace, ask, what lap might they be on that I cannot see? Before you judge your own pace, ask yourself, am I using the right scoreboard? Because sometimes you are not behind. Sometimes you've just been skating an invisible lap. And if this lands close to home today, I want to offer you something simple and true. You don't have to earn your worth by finishing first. You don't have to prove your humanity through exhaustion. And you're allowed to choose a pacing strategy that keeps you whole. Maybe one of the most compassionate things we can do for each other is to stop assuming that we all hear the same bell, because we don't. And it's okay to admit that. It really is. It's okay to admit that. So before we wrap today, a quick community ask, Nacho Knots, because this show is not just a podcast. It's a little ecosystem of care, advocacy, and practical tools. And that ecosystem stays alive when we participate. If Nachos has been helpful for you, please follow the show, share an episode with one person, and like, and also comment wherever you're listening or watching. That small engagement is one of the most powerful ways you can support this work. It tells the platform, whichever platform that is, more people should see or hear this. It helps neuro-affirming ideas reach the folks who feel alone, overwhelmed, misunderstood, or burned out, and those who don't even know what yet to search for. And if you want to support the work financially, we appreciate any donations you can spare. Donations help us with the building of accessible programming, training materials, and community partnerships. But I want to say this clearly. Sharing, liking, and commenting is even better for reach. And reach is how this message finds people who need it most. So a couple important dates to put on your radar. April 14th, 2026, we're going to be gathering for the 3rd Annual Beautiful Minds Conference in partnership with the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Think of it as a soft landing place for good people and brave stories, a room where education, advocacy, and lived experience get to sit at the same table and actually listen to one another. This year's theme is elevating neurodivergent voices and supporting mental health, well-being, and belonging, which honestly is the heartbeat of everything we do around here. So if you've been looking for a way to plug in, this is a beautiful on-ramp. I'm going to be sharing practical, real-world tools on universal design in the workplace, including how teams can better support neurodivergent employees and colleagues through clear communication, flexible systems, and everyday micro-accommodations that reduce burnout and strengthen belonging. And here's a practical reminder. Registration for this conference, if you're in Michigan, opens March 7th. So go ahead and circle that date too. Then on April 15th, we're going to be at the Michigan State Capitol for Voices in Action Day with the Michigan Legislature and Self-Advocates of Michigan. We're going to be leading training on telling your story, building coalitions and networks, because advocacy is not just about passion. It's also about skill and strategy. It's learning how to turn lived experience into language that can move a room and how to build partnerships that can keep the work going long after the day is over. So if you've ever thought, I care, but I don't know what to say, this is the kind of training for you. So also remember that April is Autism Awareness Month, and I've already booked several corporate trainings and lunch and learn sessions. If your workplace, school, library, nonprofit, or organization wants to book me for April, please reach out through humanities101.org. Remember that these sessions are practical and human. We cover a grounded overview of neurodivergence, what support can look like in real environments, and small changes that can reduce burnout and increase belonging for everyone, not just autistic people. And one more thing, Nacho Nuts, there's something powerful about autistic professionals getting out into the world and being seen, not just as a headline, not just as inspiration, but as steady, capable people doing meaningful work. Visibility is not vanity, it's representation. And it quietly tells the next autistic student, the next new hire, the next person masking their way through a meeting that they all belong here too. When we show up in rooms like this, we widen the doorway for others, and we help move neurodivergence out of the shadows and into everyday life where it's always belonged. And if that resonates, let's make it practical. Visibility only turns into change when it's supported, when stories get shared, when the conversations keep traveling, when the work is resourced enough to keep showing up in real rooms with real people. So here is the ask, simple and direct. Follow the show. Share this episode with one person. Like, comment, or leave a review. And donate if you can. If you want to bring this work to your organization in April, contact us through humanities101.org. There's a contact form there. So thank you for being part of this community. Your engagement is not just nice, it's how we keep building. And if you want to stay connected between episodes but don't want to fill out forms or reach out directly, take a minute to check out the updated website. I've added a live feed of our latest videos and shorts so you can keep up with the newest neuro-affirming insights, practical supports, and community moments as they drop. Let it be an easy way to stay in the loop and stay reminded that you are not doing this work alone. So as we come in for a landing today, I want to gather what we learned and tie it back to the heartbeat of NACHOS, the steady reminder that understanding changes everything. We talked about perspective, and we didn't treat it like a motivational slogan. We treated it like a practice. We started with that simple, powerful truth. What you see and what you hear depends a great deal on where you are standing. And we explored what happens when we shift our stance and we stop assuming the scoreboard is neutral. When we stop assuming everyone is on the same lap, when we pause long enough to ask what might be missing from the story we are telling ourselves. We held a childhood image of perspective as something tangible, a paper flipped upside down, a geometry problem seen from a new angle, a packaging engineer father who built systems that met real human needs in real contexts. That's universal design in the purest form. Not how do we force people to adapt, but how do we design the world so that more people can thrive? And when we name the adult version of the same practice, changing the medium, listening to our words in a different voice, creating a new vantage point so our brains can finally see what our stress and habits have been hiding, we started to understand it a little bit better. Then we stepped onto the ice with the story of the skater who changed the lap count, and we let it teach us what our own lives keep trying to teach us, that there are invisible laps, that people can be working harder than anyone realizes, that burnout is not always failure and slowing down is not always laziness. Sometimes it's simply the cost of skating an extra lap that no one else is counting. And from there, we made the most NACHOS move we can make. We replaced judgment with curiosity and punishment with compassion. And through all of it, we return to our core themes: self-understanding, self-regulation, self-care, and self-grace. Because this show is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming more honest, more kind, and more sustainable. It's about learning to read your nervous system like it's giving you a signal, not a verdict. It's about caring for yourself the way you would care for someone you love. And it's about building a life where you don't have to earn your worth through exhaustion. So if you're walking away with one takeaway today, let it be this: you are allowed to change your perspective without denying your reality. You're allowed to name the invisible laps you've been skating, and you're allowed to use a different scoreboard. And lastly, you're allowed to choose a pace that keeps you whole. That's the NACHOS way. So let's move into these affirmations, not as a cute closing ritual, but as a way to seal what we learned into something you can actually carry with you. Affirmations are perspective practices. They're a deliberate choice to stand in a place where truth and compassion can coexist. So here's today's affirmation. I'm allowed to change my perspective without betraying my experience. I am allowed to count the invisible laps. I am allowed to choose a pace that keeps me whole. And let me connect that to what we talked about. When you say, I'm allowed to change my perspective, you are not saying it was not hard, or it did not hurt, or I should just get over it. What you're saying is, I can look at this with more than one lens. You're giving yourself the gift of flexibility, the ability to step back from the single story your stress tries to lock you into. That's self-understanding, because it reminds you that your thoughts are interpretations, not facts. When you say, I'm allowed to count the invisible laps, you're naming something that the world often ignores. You're acknowledging the effort it takes to regulate, to translate yourself, to stay present, to keep going while carrying sensory stress, anxiety, grief, trauma, or burnout. You're telling your nervous system, I see what you've been doing. And that's self-grace, because it replaces shame with recognition. And when you say, I'm allowed to choose a pace that keeps me whole, you are practicing self-care in its truest forms. You are rejecting the false scoreboard that equates your worth with speed, and you're choosing sustainability. That's also self-regulation, because a pace that keeps you whole is the pace that allows you to recover, to reset, and to return to yourself again and again and again. So take a breath and say it with me in whatever way feels natural, out loud, in your head, or written down. I am allowed to change my perspective without betraying my experience. I am allowed to count the invisible laps. I am allowed to choose a pace that keeps me whole. And with that, Nacho Knots, we're going to close the circle for today. If this episode stirred something in you, I hope you can hold it gently. Let it settle. Let it become information instead of pressure. You don't have to figure out everything today. One small shift in perspective is enough. One counted invisible lap is enough. One kind choice for your nervous system is enough. So thank you for spending this time with me, for showing up as you are, and for being part of a community that practices understanding, care, and grace. This episode is now complete. Take what serves you, leave what doesn't, and please be tender with yourself on the way out. Until next time, Nacho Knots, stay curious, stay connected, and stay on your own side.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week. The views and opinions expressed in this video are solely those of the creator and do not reflect the views of any institution, employer, or affiliated organization.